Hey guys, and welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we'll be taking a look at the MSI GT83 VR 7RF Titan SLI. This is definitely the most powerful gaming laptop that I've ever reviewed. It's got two NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1080s in SLI inside, along with an Intel Core i7-7920 HQ processor, 64GB of DDR4 RAM, and two 256GB SSDs in RAID 0. So there's a ton of powerful hardware in this laptop, and of course it does come at a price. This laptop will set you back more than $5,000 US and more than 7,000 Australian dollars. So you'll definitely have to pay a high premium to get this powerful hardware in a laptop form factor. The first thing you'll notice about this 18.4-inch laptop is that it is absolutely enormous. It is 5.5 kilograms heavy, it's 69 millimeters thick, and while you can take it around, it is somewhat portable. It's not nearly as portable as some of the smaller 15 and 14-inch gaming laptops that you can get today. This laptop is meant to be sitting on a desk for the majority of the time. Part of the reason for this as well is that it requires two enormous power bricks to power the two GPUs inside. Each of these huge bricks is heavy. They're 330 watts each for 660 watts total power draw. And if you wanted to bring this laptop to someone else's house, for example, you'll also need to lug along these two enormous bricks. So that's something to keep in mind and kind of detracts a little bit from the portability of the laptop. As this laptop is so large, there's quite a lot of room for ports around the edges, and I was impressed with the array that MSI includes here. You'll get on the right hand side two USB 3.0 Type A ports. On the left hand side there's two 3.5mm audio jacks, an SPDIF optical audio out. There's also a hi-fi audio out, so it's got all your audio needs covered right there. Three USB 3.0 Type A ports and an SD card reader. On the rear there's HDMI 2.0, Ethernet, Thunderbolt 3, mini DisplayPort, and of course the proprietary power connector. It's also worth mentioning that this laptop comes with 5 3-watt speakers inside, which are, reasonable enough quality for a laptop, but let's be honest, if you're playing games, watching movies, or listening to music, you'll probably want to plug in a set of headphones or external speakers or something like that. Of course, there's a lot of ports to do that on this device. One of the things you've probably already noticed about the GT83 VR is that it includes a mechanical keyboard. So I guess if you have this much space to use on a laptop, you may as well put in a Cherry MX keyboard on here, powered by SteelSeries as well. Each of the key switches is a Cherry MX RGB Speed Silver, so it's very fast, 1.2mm actuation, 45 grams of force required. It's a beautiful keyboard to use for typing and gaming. You get fantastic tactile feedback. Of course, it's leagues better than any other sort of gaming laptop keyboard that I've used. It's in fact, well, it's pretty much equivalent to the mechanical keyboard I use on a daily basis with my desktop, so there's not a whole lot to complain about here. One of the things I will point out is that because it's a laptop, the keyboard is raised slightly more than you typically see for, say, just a standalone peripheral keyboard. So there's also no wrist rest, so these two things combined don't make it the perfect sort of laptop for typing out documents or anything like that, but I think while you're gaming, you'll find the mechanical keyboard to be awesome. And of course, it's RGB as well, so you can go into the SteelSeries utility included on the laptop and customize all of the individual keys to whatever color you want. There's a number of presets as well to choose from, so you can do a number of cool effects like you see on most RGB keyboards these days, and that certainly adds a little bit of flair to this laptop, and it's nice to see. One of the most contentious issues about the GT83 VR, and something I've seen a lot of comments about, is the position of the trackpad on the right hand side of the keyboard instead of below it. Of course, because they used a mechanical keyboard here, they couldn't put it in a standard laptop position, and that leaves it in somewhat this awkward position on the side here. I thought this would be pretty terrible to use, to be honest, but when I got my hands on the laptop and I started using the trackpad in this awkward-ish grip that you can see here, it wasn't actually that bad. Browsing around the operating system is quite possible and quite easy to do in this position, and well, it actually surprised me quite a lot in that regard. Of course, you won't want to use it for gaming at all. It is quite bad to use there, but of course most people will be plugging in an external mouse like you do with most gaming laptops. The trackpad also doubles as a numpad, but there's no physical keys, so it's like typing on a touchscreen, and the experience there isn't particularly good, but I guess if you need it, it's there and included here. Before I get into the performance of the GT83 VR, I just want to touch briefly on the display because it's quite an odd choice here by MSI. They've gone with an 18.4-inch 1080p IPS LCD at just 60 Hz. Now, as you'll know earlier, I mentioned that this laptop has two GTX 1080s in SOI inside, which, to be honest, absolutely crushes games at 1080p 60. So I really would have preferred to see either a higher resolution display like 1440p or 4K, because these GPUs are well suited to those resolutions, or a higher refresh panel with G-Sync, something like 120 Hz at 1080p, which we've seen before in laptops. So it's a very odd choice to limit you to 1080p and 60 Hz in such an expensive laptop, but I think what MSI is trying to do here is they figure you're going to be plugging in perhaps an external display that has either those higher resolutions or higher refresh rates. And I think to get the best experience out of the GT83 VR, you will be wanting to use an external display. Moving on to the performance here, and first of all, we'll be looking at the CPU, specifically how the Core i7-7920HQ compares to the more commonly used 7700HQ, which you'll find in most gaming laptops. The 7920HQ is a 3.1 GHz base clock over 4 cores with a boost up to 4.1 GHz in some situations. Compared to the 7700HQ, we're seeing 5% more performance in Cinebench single-threaded and 10% more in multi-threaded. In our X264 encoding benchmark, we're also seeing an extra 10% there, up to 20% more performance in WinRAR, 12% more performance in the PCMark work test, and overall we're looking at 13% more performance on average. So it's a decent little bit more performance over the 7700HQ, but nothing earth-shattering from the slightly higher clock in the 7920HQ. It's also worth mentioning the 3D Mark Time Spy benchmark, which is the most graphically intensive of all the 3D Mark workloads, compared to the MSI GT73 VR, which includes just one GTX 1080. The GT83 VR with its GTX 1080s and SLI is 68% more powerful. So we're seeing not 100% scaling from the SLI configuration here, but that's mostly due to a CPU speed limit. Moving on to games testing now, and I tested the GT83 VR here at 1080p because that is the screen resolution of this laptop. And we'll start with some older titles. So in Tomb Raider, I saw 91% more performance from the 1080 SLI compared to the GT73 VR with just a single GTX 1080 inside. So there's pretty decent scaling here in this title. But some of the other older games that I tested, like Metro Last Light, saw no change in performance. BioShock Infinite was an additional 20% from the extra GTX 1080, and Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor an extra 10% performance from the extra 1080. So not a whole ton of extra performance here from the additional 1080, but most of these titles are limited by CPU performance and run well over 100 FPS at 1080p. In Grand Theft Auto 5, I saw an additional 20% performance from the extra 1080, so again, not a huge change here. In Batman Arkham Knight, I saw no change to performance. In newer titles like Rise of the Tomb Raider, I saw an extra 44% performance improvement, where the GTX 1080 SLI was running with maximum settings at just over 60 FPS in that configuration. In Deus Ex Mankind Divided, again, no change to performance here, which is a little bit disappointing to see from a modern title that I hear supposedly supports SLI, but I actually didn't see any performance improvements here. In a few other games that I don't have charts for, like Hitman, actually turning on SLI hurt the performance of this title in DirectX 12 compared to running with just a single 1080, and in a game like Civilization 6, this game is so heavily dependent on the CPU that adding in an extra 1080 as well doesn't really impact the performance too much at 1080p. With most of the games that I usually test with running at well over 60 frames per second with the GTX 1080 SLI, I thought I've really got to find a game that will show off the performance powerhouse that is the GT83 VR at 1080p. And that game was Watch Dogs 2. Cranking up all the settings here to their maximum and running at 4 times MSAA, I managed to bring the average frames per second down to around 40 to 50 during just, driving around the city and having a bit of fun. So there are some games out there that will punish the GTX 1080s in this laptop and you won't be able to hit 60 frames per second. But of course, you can simply turn the MSAA down to 2 times or crank some of those shadow settings down slightly so that you'll run at, again, well over 60 frames per second with minimums above 60 as well. Watch Dogs 2 was just one outlier that I could find. Most titles that I tested with ran at above 60 frames per second and minimums above 60 at 1080p. So to use the real power of the GTX 1080 SLIs inside this laptop, you really will want to plug in a 1440p or 4K display and game at those higher resolutions, because you're spending $5,000 on a laptop with top-end performance. You'll want to really make those GTX 1080 SLIs run at 100% utilization, and for that you will need higher screen resolutions or something with a higher refresh rate. I'll also briefly touch on the thermal performance of this laptop. Of course, it has a beefy cooling solution inside, but I did see in my punishing AIDA64 test that the CPU was sitting at around 95 degrees Celsius and one of the GPUs was sitting at 88 degrees Celsius. The second GPU is around 78 degrees Celsius here. And this isn't really a real world indication of what you'll see in games. Typically, I saw the CPU sitting more like 85 degrees C and the GPU also at 85 degrees C in most games. But if you are punching this laptop and running everything at 100%, you will run into a few thermal issues here. I think maybe running the CPU at 95 degrees C is a little bit hot, but there is a turbofan button that you can press on this laptop that cranks the laptop from quite loud to extremely loud sort of noise levels, but that does reduce those temperatures by 5 to 10 degrees most of the time. And while this laptop does run somewhat hot and quite loud, there is room for overclocking through the MSI Dragon Center. You can push it up to 4.2 gigahertz on all 4 cores on the CPU, and you can also add an extra 200 megahertz to the clock of the GPU. This doesn't have a massive impact on the thermals of this laptop, so for most of you out there, you may as well just push it to the limits and see what it can do, because, well, you spent $5,000 on a laptop, so you may as well try and get as much performance as you possibly can. Having now used the MSI GT83 VR for a couple of weeks now, there's no doubt in my mind that this is the most powerful gaming laptop I have ever tested. It's not significantly faster than a single GTX 1080 laptop at 1080p, but if you are planning on plugging in an external display, something that's higher resolution like 1440p or 4K, or if you want to use something higher refresh, you really will benefit from the extra GTX 1080 inside the GT83 VR. And I think that's pretty much what you'd expect from a laptop that costs $5,000 or 7,000 Australian dollars. You will want the most power possible in a laptop form factor, and you definitely get this with the GT83 VR. I was also very impressed with the mechanical keyboard that's included here. It gives great tactile feedback in games, and of course it's RGB as well, so you can customize it to however you like. I think that's really something that you'll want when you're spending this much money on a laptop. I'm still not quite sure who has $5,000 to spend on a gaming laptop, but if you do have that sort of money to burn and you want the most powerful hardware you can possibly get, MSI will provide it to you in the GT83 VR. Anyway, that's it for this video review. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm your host Tim, and I'll catch you in the next one.